thank you so much for that introduction. And I just want to say what an incredible set of presentations today. It's intimidating to be here now after hearing all our wonderful speakers. And thank you to Catchlight for putting this all together and inviting me to be part of it. I think what I've decided to do in talking about photographic memory is share some of the things that we've done over the years that we did at the New York Times Magazine and give you the backstory of how these photos were brought into being. In 1997, I was still relatively new there, and I was put in charge of a photo issue for the first time, and the subject was Times Square. And it was a thrilling prospect because Times Square was on the cusp of change at that moment. Tremendous transformation was happening. And that's always good for photography. When something's undergoing change, it's definitely rich for photographers. I assigned 19 photographers across the spectrum, from documentary to fine art. I had people doing portraiture, also high concept photos. One photographer didn't even come to Times Square and created something in a studio in Germany. Anyway, I wanted to say with that issue something about all the genres of photography. And obviously doing something on Times Square, you have to speak to the signage, all the marquees and the billboards. That was a challenge. Why? If you all stop and think, speaking of memory, I'll bet everyone here has a memory of what Times Square looks like. What does that mean for a photo editor? You have to figure out how to do something different with it. So I had the thought, you can't just show it for what it looks like. Everybody knows what it looks like. So the challenge is to reinvent it. And I thought of calling Abelardo Morel, he was an artist doing beautiful camera obscura photos. He wasn't working for magazines. I called him cold and said to him, would you be willing to come spend some time making a picture, a camera obscura photo, of the signage in Times Square, knowing that the camera obscura would do its magical thing where the images would be flipped upside down? He said immediately, yes. As a matter of fact, I've been thinking of making that image. What you're seeing here on the board is just scouting photos. We swung into action, the photo department doing scouting pictures of various hotel rooms to figure out which one could be turned into the camera obscura, where obviously Abe was going to close the curtains and make a tiny aperture. And we ultimately chose the Marriott Marquis. And it had this kind of classic look of Times Square, and obviously everything is dated now. And I was quite nervous. It was the first time I was in charge of an issue, and I was extremely nervous, like, what if the pictures aren't good enough? The first picture that came in, and this was pre-digital, so you're talking about, I think it was an 11 by 14 black and white print. I open up the envelope, and I see this amazing image by Abe Morel. And I thought, oh my God, I started to cry. And I started to cry because I thought, it's a picture for the ages. If nothing else and the issue works, we've made one that will be in the books, I think. And what I love about it for this talk today is it looks like a memory, doesn't it? I felt like from the moment I saw it, it's not concrete, it's ephemeral, and memories aren't concrete, right? They're ephemeral. It's like a dreamscape of what a hotel room in Times Square would look like. And the other crazy thing about it is, over and over, working as a picture editor, over the years, I always found that often the pictures that have the most meaning and stay in your memories are ones that have layers of interpretation to them. And I think this one does, because you look at it, right? It looks like a still life. It is silent. There's no sound, and there's nobody in the picture. But in the long exposure, and I forget, I should know this, it was a long exposure, about a day long, I think, probably several thousand people walked through that scene. But of course, the long exposure, they all kind of disappear into the vapor. So I just always thought it was a wonderful moment to take something that could have been the ultimate cliche, Times Square signage and billboards, and in Abe's hands, it was transformed in a magical way, and we have that photo. The next one, I'm showing 3 pictures from that issue. The next one is, I was thinking it would be great, most of the photographers, almost all, were based in New York, as you can imagine, but I thought this would be a great moment to bring in somebody with an outsider's eyes. So I called Lars Thunborg, brilliant Swedish photographer whose work is known for kind of societal commentary, a little bit of satire sometimes, a little bit of empathy, like he really understands people. But he's also just an incredible formalist. And his assignment was very open. It was just to walk around and see what he sees. So most of the assignments, we had carefully worked with the photographers, what we wanted. And in this case, it was just to let Lars do his thing. This was the picture he made, which I think is just an incredible photo. It is the corner of 42nd Street and 8th Avenue. And at that point, 42nd Street had been condemned for the rebuilding. It was all going to be refurnished, and Disney bought the New Amsterdam Theater, did like a $30 million renovation. Anyway, the reason you see all those facades painted over like that is they were all the different condemned buildings, and somebody obviously painted them to make it look a little better. I looked at the picture and I said to myself, oh my God, it's Mondrian, right? Like how it's Mondrian. And when we talk about memory and photography, and I'm going to hit on this note more than once, the other thing we can count on is people's memory banks are filled with what they've seen, whether it's art, whether it's film, whether it's other pictures. And I love that dialogue that we all have with our kind of collective consciousness of the art that's gone before, the visual art. And Mondrian was obviously a great formalist, and I think also that Lars has that, and he saw, the other thing to think about looking at this, a lot of what photographers do is take the chaos of the world and bring some kind of harmony out of it. And he did that. This is a nothing corner, right? It was nothing, it was just chaos. And yet he made a picture that's formally stunning. There's the Mondrian that I think it's most closely aligned with. And at one point, years later, I said to Lars, it made me think of Mondrian. He said, of course I thought of Mondrian when I saw that scene, which I loved, that both of us had sort of connected with it. There's one other thing that I thought of looking at it, and that was, at one point when Lars was talking about it, he said he made the picture early on a Sunday morning. Nobody was there. He said, I love New York on a Sunday morning when the air is crisp and cool and there's no one out there. And then, of course, I thought of Edward Hoppers, one of the most beloved painters, and paintings it's in the Whitney, called Sunday Morning. So I just love that both of these, this photographer's work was referring to this sort of beautiful rectangles and elements that he could see in that moment before everything was being torn down. Before we move on from this, I did want to mention one other thing with that picture. Nothing in that corner exists today. Nothing. So again, in terms of memory, always, 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 when you make a picture, you can kind of count on you are holding that and it's going to go away. That was one other thing I thought about when they asked me to do this talk, memory, how do you talk about memory? It's a little tough because it's, so clearly part of what photography does. And I just thought a lot about it. The photographer's role is to hold our memories, right? They're going to stop them and hold them and give them back to us. One other picture from the Times Square issue. This is in the Port Authority. And I had Larry Tal go to the Port Authority and hang out. And I don't know if you can see it clearly in this projection, but you see the 4 ghostly silhouettes on the wall in what is the room that the Port Authority police hold detainees in. So if they make an arrest, they're manacled to that bench. Here is a literal memory on the walls. I couldn't get over it. And then again, it's also something that is always a reminder. And when Robert Frank was once asked, what advice do you have for young photographers? And he said, keep your eyes open. And Larry saw that and made, again, a ghostly picture that really evokes memory. Then, next up, I want to show a couple things that have to do with our history. when September 11 happened, Tuesday morning, as we all know, the magazine, the Times Magazine weekly deadline goes to press on a Friday night. And it was Tuesday morning. We were deep at work on the issue that had been in the works. And Adam Moss, the editor, said, we're going to rip up this issue. And in the next 3-4 days, we're going to do an entire issue about this. He then said, when something horrific like this happens, memorials will be made, memorials will be built. And he turned to Janet Froelich, the creative director, and said, I want you to talk to artists and have somebody come up with an idea for what the memorial could be. This is now Tuesday morning. So then Janet spoke to some different people, and she met with Julien Laverdiere and Paul Miotta, two terrific artists working together who'd had a studio in the World Trade Center. Luckily, they weren't there that day. And they came up with this idea of two beams of light going up into the sky. And we then set about bringing it to life. So this is literally the week of the attack and trying to come up with a memorial that will help people remember the day. And then Fred Conrad, a Times staff photographer, had made pictures the morning, late in the day after, of just the waterfront and the cityscape without the buildings. Then Janet worked stripping the towers, the two beams of light, and the rest is history. So this image that was made to be a cover of the magazine under tremendous deadline, and remember, everything I'm showing you is done under deadline, was basically became the memorial that now, as we know, every year on September 11 is reenacted to mark that terrible day. About 5-6 years ago, 2019, I was in an ideas meeting, a whole group of us were there, the ideas meeting being the weekly meeting when the editors, photo editors, designers, everyone's welcome to come, story editors, pitch ideas for upcoming issues. And Nicole Hannah-Jones said, the 400th anniversary of 1619 is coming later in the summer. She was pitching this a number of months early, and we should do something to mark that. And she made a passionate pitch in the meeting, and Jake Silverstein, the editor-in-chief at that point, immediately said, yes, we've got to go big with it. And then we all swung into action, figuring out the issue. And the cover image, ultimately, that you're looking at, and I think many of you hopefully know it, is the horizon line off the coast of Virginia, where the first ship with enslaved Africans arrived in the US. And I commissioned Danielle Bowman to go and photograph there, just a sad, resonant picture that shows that water holds all that memory. Then Nicole had another interesting idea for a photo essay, and the idea was to go and photograph the sites around the US where the auctions were held of the enslaved people. Most of the sites are either unmarked, this is just 6 years ago, or minimally marked, like barely marked. So we then did a lot of research, and Danielle went and made pictures at the various sites. And it was a tough photo assignment because the very fact that it didn't show what it should show was the whole point of it. And they were in East Brunswick, New Jersey, Macon, Georgia, Fredericksburg, Virginia, Wall Street, New York City, Alexandria, Virginia, New Orleans, Louisiana, St. Louis, Missouri, Richmond, Virginia. She went to each of the places, and one of them has a stadium built on it. Another of the sites, a power station, a power grid, I think that was the one in New Jersey. This is the saddest one because this is the site of the largest auction of enslaved people in American history. It was an event in 1859 called the Weeping Time. And 436 people were brought to be auctioned off, and they were to pay off the bad investments of an owner of a plantation. And in 2008, the Georgia Historical Society in the city of Savannah erected a commemorative marker near this land, but no marker can capture the scars carried by those separated on the auction block. And today the site is home to a large plywood and lumber distributor. And it also contains the Otis J. Brock III Elementary School, whose students are almost all Black. This March, the school was the site of a moving commemoration. This was I'm reading to you the direct text that we published in the magazine at the time, of the anniversary of the Weeping Time, which is now being, moments of observance and respect are being shown to it. And as you can see, it's an empty, ghostly image. And then, as we know, and we'll talk about this more in some of the other things I'm showing, and it came up in some of the other speakers' presentations, the other photographers, objects are also holders of memory. And often a photographer is commissioned to make pictures or a picture that somehow holds the memory of what the object represents. And this is a child's shackles in the museum at the Smithsonian. And this is by Erica Deeman. Everything I'm showing you had a larger photo essay, but because we're covering a lot of ground, I'm just doing showing a handful of the pictures. And then next, Ashley Gilbertson just spoke about January 6th and gave you a very beautiful, detailed explanation of what went on. I did want to clarify something. As January 6th was approaching, I had the strong feeling, it was the only time this ever happened to me like this. Nobody knew this was going to happen that day, but I went to Jake and I said, I think we should have a photographer there. The magazine wouldn't usually do coverage. We just would assign photographers for specific stories, where of course the daily paper is doing coverage all the time, making sure you're at a newsworthy event. And I thought there would be something that we'd be able to use it. And he said, okay, go ahead. I went to Amy Kellner, one of the picture editors, and to discuss, we would have a brainstorming about who we'd want to commission. And I said to her, it's not a moment for a new photographer, because I love trying new photographers, of course, all the time. I said, this is a moment for a seasoned photographer, and I think somebody seasoned with some combat experience. It was just a feeling that things might get crazy. The rest is history. But I wanted you to know that the reason that Ashley was offered the double day rate was because of that. War photographers, anybody we send into a war zone gets a double day rate. So just thought you should know that. And I'll just give you a little more background on what he told you, because you'll remember the talks were happening quite a ways away from the Capitol. He was covering that. Amy's monitoring the different things that were coming over her phone, telling her what's going on. At one point that morning, she texts Ash and she says, get to the Capitol. He texts back one word, en route. He was already on his way. He is an elite runner. So he also had the ability to leap over the walls and literally get there. And I really have to emphasize that. You have to not only be a brilliant photographer as he is, but you have to be in shape. And he leapt over the walls, and then he had to make all those split-second decisions. Do you go in with the rioters? They're breaking the windows. So anyway, I just want to remind everyone here that after the fact, we can forget the tremendous risk that everyone, including the photographers, were at. But in terms of memory, there was one other thing, and this was also a funny moment, when he texted back en route. Then Ashley texted Amy and said, what does Kathy want? And she said, what do you want from this? And I said, tell Ashley to make the iconic picture, which is useless advice, right? Absolutely useless direction. And by George, he followed it. And he made the most, what I think, important picture of the day, because it's Officer Eugene Goodman. It became an iconic photo. It was the hero on a horrendous day with awful rioting and just, we know the whole story. He made the picture of the hero, of the person who who held back the crowds and showed courage on that day. And that's, again, yeah, exactly. The photographer holds enormous power, always. And they show us what they think we should see. And obviously, Ashley felt we should see that. And he was in there with the mob, and he's like, I'm going to get this picture. Then the next one is, we're going to switch gears now to something else entirely different. And this is, We had a cover story coming up. This is in end of February, very beginning of March, of on West Side Story, the revival on Broadway. So West Side Story, we all know. And it was a big revival coming up. And we commissioned Philip Montgomery to do pictures. I managed to convince the producer, Scott Rudin, this was a tough phone call, like the Friday night before previews were opening, saying, could we please get the cast into a studio so that we could photograph them? And obviously they're rehearsing for the preview, and the last thing they're going to want to do is photo shoot. We were able to pull it off. They got the whole cast, 30 people, young people, all of them, their first time on Broadway. And the director and the choreographer were there. And Philip, we had a whole, like this, the set was bigger than this stage, and it was draped in black. So we had a big, beautiful set in the studio where he could do the dance numbers. And then the performers, they were doing the dance numbers that were part of the choreography for the show, literally which is unusual to even have the choreography there, but this was a big deal. And it was great, and we were watching, we're having a lot of fun. I saw something I never saw in a Times Magazine shoot before. At one point, before one of the scenes with the jets, all the guys got down on the floor and started pumping up just to look particularly good for the picture, which we thought was great. And then he made beautiful pictures, right? But they didn't bring something else. They just brought the choreography of the show, which is fantastic, beautifully lit. And then Philip said to the performers, why don't you go over here onto this cloth? And he had a small cloth that was off to the, sorry about this, guys, off to the side, not on the main set. Imagine a tiny cloth that was just draped down. So a couple of them piled onto it, and they start just playing around, like roughhousing. And this amazing photo happens. How do you make a photo like this? It's an impossible picture. You could never art direct that picture. And what I also love is that, talking about cross-assigning, Philip is a documentary photographer. He's a documentarian by nature, from day one in his photography. He's published a book in recent years on the fault lines in America, drug crisis, racism, all the politicization, all the things that we deal with. But it's fun sometimes to give somebody something they wouldn't have, and clearly there would be a lot of movement in this. And the way that this happened was, I talked to him later. He wanted to enforce chaos, to use his words. He feels that the studio is too controlled. The studio environment is just too controlled. And he thought, if I just have that little cloth to the side and it looks like it's like nothing, not really part of all this, something will happen. So they start horsing around. He makes that picture. As we're watching it, I think to myself, oh my God, it's Raft of the Medusa, the painting by Jericho. I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe it. Even the lower left, the guy's head down on the edge. So I'm just thinking about it. So I say to Philip, I go over to him at some point in the studio in the break in the action, and I pull it up on my phone. It's Raft of the Medusa. And he says, no. Turns out I didn't know until later. He was thinking of this sculpture, Laocoon and his sons, by the Greek sculptors, the 3 Greek sculptors whose names I cannot remember off the top of my head. But he that's what it evoked for him. So I say it in terms of memory when I was first just trying to think what to talk about here. I think that memory bank is so important that we all have, and you have to keep nourishing it. You have to keep looking at and seeing things, or reading, whether it's reading poetry or looking at film, that will subconsciously just be there, so that when you're in a moment like that and you've got these beautiful actors, singers, performers tumbling about, your eye is educated, knows what it's looking for. Then I'm going to show you, this is are we going to get the video or no? This is a beautiful video clip. It was so magical that day in the studio that I actually called Scott Thody, my husband, and Sylvie Thody, my daughter, who happened to be home at that time, which I've never done that. I was like, you guys have to come. This is an amazing shoot. And Sylvia had the foresight, she made this beautiful clip of them tumbling about, but I think we can't get it to roll, but you can get a sense of it. They were laughing their heads off, actually, as they did this. And then ultimately, oh, there we go, we do have it. I just love it because it looks so classical in the still photo. And here you see what's really going on. They're just like, total. Do we not love photography? To be able to capture something like this. And then, of course, Philip gave us a magnificent cover for that issue. The other thing is that I just want to say, okay, so hold on, before we go to that I wanted to say about that is, one thing I've learned is you've got to plan, but you have to build in the space for serendipity with photography. So if you're going in the studio or going out to cover something, you've got to plan and be ready with what you're going to do, but build in the space for serendipity to happen, and or some kind of improvisation, and that's what he did that day. Now, you heard me tell you the date. It was the beginning of March. They were premiering in their first thing on Broadway, and the whole thing came to a crash 2 weeks later, and we all went home and we began to hunker down because of COVID-19. And then we also assigned Philip to cover the COVID-19 crisis. This picture to me is so powerful because, first let me back up. You can't do anything without access, so I'm always grateful. Shannon Simon worked it, and she got us access to 9 of the 11 public hospitals in New York City, which was really unheard of because everybody was terrified to have anybody in the hospitals unless they were the sick, whose families weren't even allowed in. Remember, family members couldn't go in, all pre-vaccine, or the doctors, but she got the permission. And I always, when I saw this, I thought, it's like marching into battle. So the healthcare worker is tying the scrubs. We get it. They had to be totally covered at all times, and she's basically marching into battle. And then he's using his dramatic light that he's known for. Another important thing for photographers, it's always about light, and that means either seeing natural light or bringing light to the scene, and Philip works with the strobe magnificently, and it helped enormously in the hospitals. Why? Because partly for privacy, HIPAA laws, the darkening allowed by heightening certain areas, it then let other areas fall to darkness, so we didn't reveal any patients, and it also heightens the reality, as you can see, sometimes adding in that light. So he spent a lot of time with incredible pictures. I'm only showing this one again because we're going to cover a bunch of territory, but he did a magnificent job under incredibly difficult circumstances. And I'm just going to remind everybody when we talk about memory, why it's important to have these pictures for history's sake. On his first day of shooting, 1,162 patients had been hospitalized with the virus in New York, and 349 had died. By April 6th, his last day, 19,177 people had been hospitalized with the virus in New York, and 3,302 had died. So I just say that because it's like, oh yeah, it really was that horrendous. And you'll remember at the time, there weren't many pictures for us to look back to of a catastrophe, a health catastrophe like that. The previous one in American history was the influenza virus in, 1918? There aren't all that many pictures of it. So anyway, these pictures will exist, God forbid, if there's another pandemic, just as a reminder of what it was like. So again, Philip held the responsibility of making those pictures to get into the magazine, to show the readers why they had to stay home, why they had to mask up, why when the time came they needed to get a vaccine once the vaccines arrived. So I've always thought it was an incredible body of work. We then, of course, as we're working on that, knew that we had to get into a funeral home. Debbie Samuelson was the photo editor who worked it on that. She got access to the Ferenga Brothers Funeral Home in the Bronx, and Philip went on to do that. Out of all the pictures he made, I'm just showing 2. They were incredible pictures, the coffins lined up in what would have been the chapel or the viewing room. This was the picture that stood out for me. Why? It shows Sal Ferenga just pushing a casket through. It just looks to me like a stark kind of metaphor for that movement from one life this life on earth to whatever the afterlife is. And he's got the frame cut in half as he comes through that plastic stripping, the weather stripping, whatever it is. He's got the cigarette hanging out of his mouth. It's an extraordinary document. It's incredibly real. It's absolutely real and grimy, and you can smell the cigarette smoke and the grease on the strips. And yet, I think it transcends into being a kind of classical picture of life and the afterlife. It really, I think that the simplicity of it speaks to it. And I couldn't help but think in this one, it's the ferryman going along the river Styx. That somehow that was the metaphorical thing that occurred to my mind. And then the next one, sadly, is one of the deceased, and this was Mr. Purawal. His family gave full permission for Philip to document them in this process of grieving. They were allowed into the funeral home, and you could see his widow is wearing the plastic gloves that tells you what's going on. And his light becomes a celestial light there. And he was obviously putting a picture on the cover of the magazine of somebody in a coffin, particularly during that crisis. We had lots of discussion about the ethics of it and decided the newsworthiness of it made it important for us to do that. And afterwards, Debbie said that when she spoke to the Purawal family again, who she had developed a relationship with on the phone, arranging all of this, they appreciated the respect with which he was treated and the fact that his memory would live on the cover of the Times Magazine to mark this historic moment. Then we're going to move on to something else. In all my 39 years at the Times Magazine, there was never a moment when there wasn't a war or wars going on. So we always had the reality facing us of having to figure out a way to cover the war, send photographers into danger. And I'm going to show just a couple things to talk about that. One of the hard things with war, and Ashley almost touched on it, I want to get onto it more, is when wars begin, they often go on for a long time. So when there's first an invasion, like the invasion in Ukraine, in Kyiv, in Ukraine by Putin, everybody's paying attention. They're seeing all the pictures. There's total focus around the world on it. Time goes by. It gets harder to come up with a way to make pictures that will hold and grab readers' attention, or I should really say grab it as they're looking at their phone and hold it. So you try to come up with other ideas. So we were brainstorming. I was talking with Lindsay Addario, who I'm sure many of you know, the great war photographer. She's extraordinary. We've worked together, it's over 15 years. And she sent in 7 or 8 pitches, and one of them was to do the children on the front line. This was a year in. So the war had been going on for a year. The paper had been covering it vigorously and magnificently and powerfully. What does the magazine do? And I spoke with Jake Silverstein, the editor, and we felt like, and Gail Bicker, the creative director, that to focus in on the children would be great. And then I felt strongly one child. And Lindsay had gotten the idea to do this because she had seen this boy that you see in this picture, who was an 11-year-old named Yegor, in a frontline hospital. And it made her think of her own son, who was 11 at the time, and knowing her son was home, comfortable in London where they live. And I said, I think we should do just one child, but I want to give you some advice to the photographers. One of the challenges with the fact that most readers are seeing our photojournalism on the phone in their pocket says that a lot of readers are going like this. And if you do a series of portraits, and not that we don't want to do that, we do that, but it gets harder to keep people's focus. So you have to kind of almost think about it, not only in terms of storytelling, which has come up here today in a number of powerful ways, but one character does allow the reader to connect. So we had a whole photo essay cover story in print in the magazine and a long extended piece on the phone. And readers, we saw, you see the data and the metrics. They really stayed with it. It got some of the best, longest engagement. And I think it's because it was all the story seen through Yegor. You look at this picture A wounded soldier has just been brought in. He spent a lot of time at the hospital because his mother, the reason he's still at the front line in this town, which was in the next town over from where there was active fighting, is because she was a medic. So she was a healthcare worker, and she felt compelled to stay there. So he would often be there with her. There were no other kids left in the town. His schooling was just remote. And he had learned how to tie tourniquets. Anyway, what I thought here, and there was another picture earlier where him that we saw, Yegor turning and looking back at us, to me is an accusation. How can you adults do this? How can you do this to us? It's kind of like, why? And again, that question of man's inhumanity to man being part of the reason we need photojournalism, I think is inherent in this. And then as you look closer, we see what he is looking at. And then we can't help but think, what memory will Yegor take away from that? Like, what will be in his mind as a result as he's witnessing this? And Lindsay's pictures will at least always hold for him something. And it was interesting because she said, these are her quotes, Yegor watched, internalized, sometimes asked questions, but mostly just tried to tuck away what he witnessed into a compartment in his mind reserved for when he was no longer a child. And then Yegor's own words, I can't explain it, he said. It's scary. I feel bad for the guys. They are young. I feel bad. Lindsay did all the photography, the video, and the interviews, which I just want to cite that because that's a remarkable thing. And then I had put this picture into the tray. This was early on in the war in Afghanistan, and this was Lindsay had embedded for us with, I think for about 2 months. It was a long assignment with American soldiers, and she had grown quite close to some of the men, spending so much time hunkered down, and was there one day during an ambush. And she knew Sergeant Rugal, the man whose body's being taken down. And I only show it without wanting to say too much more because I just always thought it was a remarkable picture. And it looks like it could be World War II. Again, some of the craziness of war that the imagery weirdly looks like. Sometimes a powerful portrait can show the scars of war. This is Paolo Pellegrini back in Ukraine. He also did a bunch of work for us. And the face alone is about memory, and it can contain so much. And then that made me think of, and there you get no context, so this is clearly a decision. You don't see anything but this soldier's face. And then here, this is the beautiful portrait that Samara Boualouf did, not for the magazine. This came after I left in the past year, and she did it for the paper, for the Times. And I think it's just so powerful because, again, the innocence, the expression in his face, the fact that he won't only have memories, he'll have a constant physical reminder of the price he's paid to have been caught up in war as a child. And there's also some hope in it because he is a survivor, and I just wanted to show it because she did remarkable work for quite a while, a photographer in Gaza. And then one more by Paolo back in Ukraine. I only show it because it's remarkable seeing the horizon line is so important in photography. And he jumped out of the car when he saw the funeral happening as they were driving through some country area in Ukraine at that moment. And to make that picture, there's about 25 faces, each one we can stare at. And that's also, I think, part of our mission is to, in holding the photographers, to make pictures like that that are so rich and so detailed. And then as we finish up looking at the war pictures, which sadly I felt I had to show, and we've obviously seen others today, particularly powerful work by Ashley. This was one other picture that he didn't show that always struck me because this picture of this soldier's bedroom, this is Christopher Shearer, just tells us he died so young. So there, a reminder that most of the people who get killed in war, they're extremely young. The walls still often look like a high school student or somebody who's just out of school. And as he said, we titled it Shrine Down the Hall. But Ashley coming that day to pitch this idea to me that he had already invested some of his own time to do the first several pictures. I think he said it was 6. I'll never forget that day because like, oh my God, we had been at war in Afghanistan for years, and he had come up with something else. And Ash has also spoken about, and I don't think he mentioned it in the talk, that we not only need to humanize the soldiers and the victims in war, but the families left behind. And as he told those powerful stories about the families that they can't enter the room, they can't empty the bins that the military sent back. And some of the pictures were made months after the death, and some were made like 6 years later. And that's just a powerful statement. And then one other thing I'll tell you, which was, did I just do that? Just a practical thing. When he was talking about the approach and the fact he wanted to do it all panoramic, I remember thinking, oh, I'm not so sure. Panoramic's hard on the printed page, right? And it doesn't allow you to fill the space, and I just wasn't sure. And I expressed that reservation, and Ashley said, no, it's going to be great. And boy, was he right. So don't listen to the photo editor is the takeaway from that one. Thank God he didn't listen to me on with that memory. The next one's going, I warn you, to be really sad. Every year we did, I'm not there any longer, the magazine does, sometimes I fall into it, the Lives They Lived issue at the end of the year. It's very popular with readers. It's an issue of short essays and photo essays about people who've passed, and most of them are people of renown, not all, but most. One year, a couple years ago, Jake said, I want the entire issue to be about children killed by gun violence. Whoa. That year was the first year that the number of children who died by gun exceeded the number killed in car accidents. So there was also a newsworthy reason to do it. It was the first time it had happened. So often with the Lives They Lived, we would do a portfolio that sometimes was the objects. You're going to see a great one in a minute left behind. Sometimes it was, we've also done the rooms that would evoke the spirit of the portrait of the person, similar to like what Ashley did with the bedrooms of the fallen. I felt immediately, given the fact these were going to be kids, that we should not do any professional photography and instead fully illustrate the issue with their own pictures, their TikTok videos we could pull clips from, we could run the videos online, their photos from Family Album, the photos they're posting on social media. So we decided to do it. It was a difficult task because it basically meant, and I'll put up the picture that ended up being the cover, Kristen Geisler, one of the picture editors, would call the families, can you imagine the level of grief, and speak with them and talk about it to see if they would give us the pictures. And they did. They understood. Here you see Darius Dugas, who was also 11 years old when he was killed in a accidental flyby shooting. And he, if you look at the treatment online, the pictures move, the videos are so stirring. And here we decided to pull a screen grab, and I show that because that's going to come up more. And we went to great lengths, this is again just a practical aside, to make sure it worked. Like Gail and I, we proofed this numerous times and kept reproofing it just to be sure we could hold the very degradation of the image there with the backlighting is the very thing that makes it powerful and ghostly, right? We had to make sure that we would hold that. And then in some cases, again, some of these are stills. Here you see we would run. It was so powerful on the phone. And here, again, photography. The photos are made often for a very different reason than what they ultimately end up holding. And here it's now sadness, and yet the pictures are made at moments of joy and playfulness, a selfie. This is the Yambo family, and it's her sweet 16 party with her father. So I felt like there was something actually deeply spiritual by going to their own private pictures and using them. The hard thing was that I didn't anticipate was when we got it all in, so we had many different pulls, we went into, and this was shortly after everybody was just starting to come back after having been hunkered down at home for a year working remotely. So we had all kind of lost a little bit our ability to be with other people. It was, I'm sure others of you have felt it, where it was just awkward. And a bunch of us, Gail and the designers and me and Kristen, we were working late that night with figuring out the layouts. And we were in it's like a tiny conference room, a very small room that comfortably holds maybe 4 or 5 people. And on the wall were all the kind of rough layouts pinned up so that we could get a sense of, is it working, that image versus that. And again, since we were blowing things up that were often all shot on a phone, we just want to make sure everything was working. I can still remember vividly sitting at the table and feeling overwhelmingly guilty because as I'm sitting there, these children's faces are looking down at me, and the power that those vernacular pictures, their private photos had, I had not experienced it, even with some of the tough imagery that we had produced over the years of, sad crisis, war photography. There was something about this that was different, and I couldn't shake it. It was just, we ordered a pizza because we were working so late, and we were starving, and we started to have a drink and the pizza, and I just thought, this is wrong. This is disrespectful. This is wrong. They were no longer photos. It just was a weird, I share it just because it speaks to the power of photos and the memory that those pictures held. And then it was when they were shown at the first photo meeting where the rest of the magazine team, the designers and the visual people and the story editors that are involved, and Jake come in, there were some tears, and Kristen started to tear up. And then Marcela Valdez, one of the writers that was working on the issue, at one point saw Kristen, and Kristen just recently told me, because I called her just to ask about this again, just to talk about it, and she said, Marcela stopped by her desk and said, she said, what are you doing? And Kristen said, well, I'm calling all the families to get the images. And Marcela said, that's a lot of grief to be a container for. And I just thought, wow, that's exactly what we're talking about, that often the photographer has to hold a lot of grief. Then there's one other very sad picture coming up, and this is by Eleanor Carucci, and this is 3 of the forensics inspectors whose job was to go into the site in Sandy Hook after the massacre at that school. And there they go in to document the evidence. And when we thought about this, Jessica Dimson was the photo editor on this. She is now the director of photography. We thought of Eleanor because to make this portrait of these people requires a photographer with deep empathy and sensitivity, but also strength, right? And I've always thought Eleanor has this unique way of combining, of having deep, as you saw in her pictures of her family, herself, empathy for the people in the pictures, and at the same time, the courage to use a kind of strong light, a clarifying light. Her pictures bring clarity, and we also talked about beforehand eye contact. That's a big question that my entire career, you go back and forth. Do you want eye contact? Do you not? Often looking away, the photographer has more power over the sitter. Not everything, I'm talking in obviously quick, talking about complex things here, just in a quick once over. The subject, the sitter looking at you, holds a lot of power because their eyes are looking at you. But sometimes it's harder to make a powerful picture where there's eye contact. Sometimes it can almost be better. So we talked about wanting somehow, since their eyes had to see what they have to see in that job, that maybe it would be good for do a picture with the eye contact for the readers. And I think this is a haunting image. And to Eleanor's credit, she made a very beautiful picture of what couldn't have been easy, bringing those 3 together at that moment. So then we go on to the next, and that is showing a couple examples of, again, this idea that objects hold memories. I saw this year, after I'd left the Times, a beautiful portfolio of images of the objects retrieved from the Los Angeles fires. These are by Devin Akhtar Yalkin. So I reached out to him because I thought they were so beautiful and haunting. And what I thought was amazing about this one is it's just so detached. And I wanted to know why he photographed them in this way that's so powerful. And I'm going to give you his words. which I actually just got from him in the middle of the night last night. He said, I chose to photograph them in black and white, isolated against a solid black background, because I wanted to create a void, a space where nothing else exists, where the viewer has no context to lean on. That emptiness was important to me. I wanted to evoke the sensation of everything disappearing, the way it physically and emotionally feels to have your world dissolve into ash. By stripping away the environment and color, I tried to mirror that experience, making every object float in a kind of absence. And this was a fragment from a sculpture in somebody's backyard. And then this one, the Slinky, was, I remember in the caption that ran with the picture, the owner said that she had always loved Altadena, where she grew up and wanted to raise her child. And she used to use this Slinky to entertain her child while they were traveling. And it was one of the few things she was able to recoup from the fire. And then, this was the cover of the Lives They Lived issue years ago. And it was the first time we did object. And this was because Henry Lutweiler was photographing these incredible objects with just the finest kind of studio lighting and shadows, very precise. And we then had him do the people who had died this year. This was one of the most remarked upon, probably the most well-remembered Lives They Lived cover. It's James Gandolfini's Cadillac that he kept parked at the Jersey Shore for when he took his kids there on the weekends. And the trunk was filled with like kids' beach toys. I consider this one of the examples of like the alchemy of photography. How do you make an emotional picture of a car? Like, it's impossible, right? And we saw it and we're all like, wow. And then the reaction from readers was huge to this picture of a car, and the design exquisite, like that choice. The design of the cover is a whole summit unto itself, right? Like the powerful design. And also want to say we have Rem Duplessis here, who was the former creative director at the Times Magazine. So that's a great privilege to have him here today. And I had the privilege of working with him for over a decade. So there we have Gandolfini's Cadillac. And then a number of weeks ago, I called Henry just to talk about the shoot again and ask what it was like, how he did it. And he's very precise. He said, I photographed, he brought it into a big studio that was carefully lit for car studio. And he said, I shot it sideways, I shot the left side, I shot the right side, I did the front, I did the back, I did the open trunk. He was extremely careful to do it all. It was a long day. He leaves, just as he goes to leave and he's headed home, he thinks, oh my God, I didn't do Gandolfini's car key ring. He didn't think of it. And he said he became desperate because of why? You touch the key ring, right? In a way you don't think of the owner's touch on the car. But then he called the friend of James Gandolfini, who had been kind enough to drive the car from New Jersey to the studio, and said, can you come back tomorrow with the keys? And he agreed. So he was able, and I love that story just because that's what photographers do, right? He missed that one little thing, and he kept him up all night, and he was able to shoot it the next day. So then, I got a question for you all. How many of you have held a pencil today? Whoa, there's a handful, like very few. Again, one of the roles of photography is to hold on to something, and nostalgia is a part of that. So Chris Payne came to me. He had been obsessed with a pencil factory that had been in the same family for like 3 generations or something in Jersey City. It took him 5 years of asking to get in. He said he always loved, and he does big, beautiful industrial kind of sites and photos and architecture. That's part of his thing. But he had loved pencils when he was a kid. He loved to go to Woolworths. He loved to see the different kinds. And he's like devoting his life to capturing manufacturing processes that are going away. He's done the looms. Most of the weaving places in New England are gone. When he initially has to do this, I think he referred to the fact that they probably won't be there much longer, which was not the way to get the door opened. He learned a lesson. So then next time he went, by then he had luckily done a book on the Steinway Piano Factory. So he was able to show that book, and they're like, oh, okay, you can come. And he went back to this factory on his own. At a certain point, we commissioned it, but he really did it all on his own. But we're so thrilled to publish it. And I think he told me he went there 30 times, 35 times. And you could just see beautifully lit, very careful. It's important to get the workplace. And I tell people all the time, just regular photographers, and this came up, family photos, of course. So many family albums are filled with vacations and the unusual moments. People get the urge to pick up the phone take pictures of the unusual moments. But it's the ordinary, everyday, your parent at work. They should take pictures. The kids are going to want to see that, the grandkids someday. So I love that these people who work in that factory have this wonderful body of work that represents what they did for years of their lives. And he has many more also. We did a big portfolio, and one of the things that I just loved, it got a huge reader response. It got hundreds and hundreds of letters. Why? Pencils, New York Times readers, that's like a love fest. So it really was one of the most reacted to. Who would have guessed this humble object? But even today, we see not that many people are touching. Of course, you're all looking, thinking, she's got index cards. I'm clearly appreciate some of the old. And then, I don't know where I am with time. I have one other thing I could show. Should I go ahead, or are we at the limit? What's that? Go ahead. Okay. Sorry, I can't tell. It's all right. One of the years, every year we would do a New York issue, which honestly, if you were to ask me my favorite issue to work on each year, it's the New York issue, because I love New York so deeply. My husband says I should run for mayor. He tells me regularly. It's such a photogenic place. But anyway, so we were doing New York, and the theme, we had decided, I think I had said, let's do 24 hours. That's a classic subject, day in the life, 24 hours. It's nothing new, but it's what you do with it. And then Jake said, we need another filter. Let's do love. Oh my God, right? What can you imagine something more wonderful to work on? So first thing I do, I call Ryan McGinley, whose pictures are full of love and joy and sensuality and sexuality and all of it, innocence, everything. And I describe what we're up to and say, do you have an idea for a photo essay? And he says to me, I've always wanted to rent a film truck that has the back open, a small truck with the back open, and do couples kissing at the back. And as the truck is driving this way, you'll see the city behind them. Clearly very cinematic idea. And by the time the phone call was over, I was so excited. Again, phone call. That was not an email, which I'm glad to say. I raced to Jake's office in Gale, and I'm like, oh my God, listen to this idea. And they loved it, of course. We swung into action. We saw it as the strong possibility for the cover. And weeks were spent casting it. It was a combination of some people in Ryan's world, people then that Jessica Dimson was the photo editor working on it with me, big issues. We had a group of people, and she worked on the casting. We wanted a diverse range of every kind of love, age, ethnicity, youthfulness, everything, so that it represented the diverse population of New York. The day of the shoot, we were all set up. The way it was worked out was we had arranged, Jessica had worked with a producer so that the film truck would pick up several couples at this intersection. They'd go and their pictures would be done by Ryan, each with, switching up and going to the back of the film car. And then we'd drop them off point B, and we'd pick up 2 or 3 more couples there, and then we'd go and they'd get dropped off at point C. The shoot started at 1 minute after midnight, up in the Bronx. We were with them in a tracer car, and we had agreed Ryan was going to shoot the whole 24 hours, but Jessica and I were each going to take 4 hours off to go home and take a nap. And I go home first, so I leave the car at about, and we had an escort police car in front. and the film car, and then us and back. And I leave at, I don't know, I think it was 2 a.m. I go home, and at 6 a.m., I get up and the phone rings, and it's Jessica. And she says, the production's been shut down. I'm like, shut down? This was like, I cannot tell you how much was invested in making this all happen. And it was being planned as, the hope was that we would have 24 covers on a split run, something we'd never done for the 24 hours. And the reason it was shut down was we wanted all 5 boroughs. It's almost impossible to get a permit to shoot on the Brooklyn Bridge, I assume because everybody wants to shoot on the Brooklyn Bridge. So we couldn't get a permit. But at about, I guess, I don't know, 5 in the morning, as sun's coming up, a little bit of sun just about to come up, beautiful, that blue pre-dawn light. The police, they really wanted to go over the bridge, and the policeman in the escort car said, it's okay, you can do it. They go over the bridge, and when they get to the bottom of the bridge, his superior officer was waiting and said, that's it, you did not have a permit, you were not allowed to do that. I'm shutting this down, you're not allowed to use the film car again today. So we were really in trouble, big trouble. I race out to Brooklyn, we meet under the bridge there, and Ryan and I start talking, and we're troubleshooting and problem solving, and Jessica like, what are we gonna do? And then a producer on his team, Mary Clancy, I don't even know her that well, but I've always remembered her. She comes up with the best idea ever. She said, why don't you go to Times Square and rent one of those tourist buses, the double-decker open tourist buses? I was like, yes. We hop in the car, we race to Times Square, we go in. I have no idea if this is going to work, no idea at all, but desperation was weighing in, which can help you sometimes, right? Like, we had to make this happen. I negotiate with the owner, could we have a bus with the driver till midnight? So we were talking then the next, what would that be, was 16 or 17 hours, whatever. And we figure out a price. I, to this day, have amnesia. I can't remember what it was. It was definitely beyond the usual editorial budget, but we had to do it. We get in the bus, and I can't, so basically you have to picture it. We're on the top deck. You're not allowed to stand up in those buses. We luckily had a safety person the whole time. Ryan does enough pictures in his own artwork where people jump off roofs into crash mats, and they do all sorts of things. So he likes to have a safety advisor on set. So we had that person already. So he was keeping an eye on the kissers and Ryan to make sure everything was okay. But we needed another element. You don't know till you're standing, and some of us were standing occasionally on a double decker, like particularly Ryan doing the pictures, how much low-hanging stuff there is in New York City. Plus, we couldn't do all 5 boroughs. The bus was only, we could only do Manhattan, so we had to also change all those pickups anyway. But these are the kind of stories photo editors like to share with each other, and remember what it took to change all of those. But we had somebody stand on the front of the bus, and anytime we were approaching like a low-hanging traffic light or branches on the Upper West Side coming out of Central Park, he'd yell, duck, and we'd all go down, and we'd go right onto the low-hanging stuff. I mean, I tell you this now, I probably wouldn't tell you that if I was still at the Times, but it was a glorious day. As we would stop at intersections, sometimes, particularly like during the day, people would look up, they'd see these passionately kissing couples, and they'd start applauding. There'd be like 20 New Yorkers applauding, like, what more could you ask? So how does this fit in with the theme today of memory? This is a moment when we created memories for people. We created great memories for all of these wonderful lovers. And guess which one I think was the best cover? I'm only showing you some of the 24. Of course, the Brooklyn Bridge, of course. So it was worth breaking the, I mean, it wasn't breaking the rules. We were given permission. It was just that, I guess it wasn't his permission to give, that officer. But so I've always loved that that decision was made at that moment, go for it, which I think I would have done the same if I was in the car at that moment. But then I was going to wrap it up with this. Again, there's one other thing. Do you want to see a couple of my office romance photos? Okay, you guys, you're the best. I'll show you some of my. So, you know, I fortunate enough to work in the Renzo Piano Design building, which has magnificent light. Why? Because it's all clear glass. No super tall skyscrapers are built today with clear glass, right? Renzo didn't want to have sunglasses on his building. He didn't want the windows to be gray or green. He wanted them to be clear. And the way he was able to do that and still limit the amount of light and heat coming into a building, all the environmental codes you have to meet, was he came up with that idea of the white. It has her horizontal white ceramic rods sheathing the entire building. After we moved into that building from the old Times building, at first, I didn't see it. I missed the old grungy building. I just did. You know, I don't adjust to change well. But I've adjusted to retirement. But anyway.
That's questionable.
That's questionable. Yeah, it's true. That's Scott, my husband, Scott Doty. It is questionable. But one day I saw a zigzag of light on the staircase, and I just took out the phone in my pocket and I made a picture and I got hooked. And it was just incredible. So in the same way people would go get a cup of coffee in the late afternoon, I'd go to a window. This was on 40th Street, and just, come on, look at that. I mean, it's stuff, magical things would happen. Once in a while, this is a special occasion, I'd get permission to go up onto the roof. That's Gail Bickler, the creative director, and the roof is like a film set unto itself. Then at one point after I had been making them, Jake, just for myself, I was doing it just for pleasure. I was going in on all the weekends to shoot still lives. I just was drunk in love with the light in the building. It's magical light. And, you know, in the morning you get the hard light on the east side of the building, and the late afternoon you get that warm light on the west side. And then he asked me, would I do the contributor portraits? A redesign was happening on the table of contents, and he wanted me to do the contributor portraits in a kind of office romance style. So I thought, why not? That's Hiroshi Sugimoto. And that was another one, the serendipity of photography. When he arrived, of course, I was extremely intimidated. Photographing a major photographer, like your heart's pounding if you don't do justice to him, right? And then I said to him, do you have anything you could hold, like eyeglasses or something? Because sometimes it helps if your sitter is holding something. And he takes out these magnificent glasses that I said, where'd you get them? He said, I designed them. He had just designed them for something like Cartier. So always ask the question. You know, I like to see the lessons and stuff. So if you feel like you want to ask. And then this was just one ordinary moment in the cafeteria. And that was somebody sitting there, and I just, oh my God, the beauty of it. I did lots of the contributor portraits. That's Dina Lutovsky, a wonderful photographer who's done a lot for the magazine. And again, just playing with the light, which, as you can imagine, moving constantly. So there's a lot, these are still contemplative portraits, but the people are bathed in that light, but that light's constantly changing. And then at the end of the workday, I'd often go up to the west side and photograph still lives or whatever the case may be. This is Amanda Demi, who wears a great hat. And at that point, I wanted to morph the linearity of the rods. I had been photographing them so much. I was like, well, how can I mess with them? And I would hold up sheets of Mylar, which would then reflect them and make the rods dance. I always had this sense that the rods were dancing and that I could somehow play with that. And I can't tell you, every time I made a picture, I'd be like, thank you, Renzo Piano. Because without the building, I wouldn't have even started down that photographic road. And then this is a writer, Janine Interlandi, a writer on the opinion pages of the Times, and just people would go to their own space. Like, light holds memories. I swear, sitting in that strong light, I think it brought memories to them. They would go to a quiet place. This is Jessica Dimson, who's now the director of photography, and that was a picture made shortly after we first reoccupied the building following the whole remote work from home days. And then the last one, I did this early on, and it just, now I'm not there. Anyway, I made the pictures just for fun art play, and now the pictures have a different meaning because it's always about memory. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for having me.